I'm gonna pass it off to Caitlin Rose next. Caitlin is the policy director for the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network, where she advances state policy priorities, strengthens member resources, and fosters regional partnerships across the Southeast. With a background in environmental science, atmospheric chemistry, and public health, she brings an interdisciplinary approach to sustainability and local climate action. Prior to SSDN, she worked with the Triangle J Council of Governments and the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, contributing to clean transportation initiatives and the development of the NC North Carolina Clean Energy Plan. Welcome, Caitlin. So happy to have you here this morning.
Appreciate that intro. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Just one second. Okay. Great. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and engaging in conversation with you all. And Ruthie, really appreciate you teeing us up to think about collaborative engagement from a variety of different perspectives. I'm going to shift our focus to a completely different topic, which is state energy policy and utility regulation. My goal today is to make that really, really boring topic really exciting for all of you. So if by the end of this presentation, you're even marginally more interested and excited about state policy engagement, I will have done my job. So as Gretchen said, I am the director of SSDN's state policy program. Our goal is to equip local governments with the knowledge, capacity, and tools to engage with state policy processes that influence their ability to meet their climate and energy goals that they have set locally. So we recognize that many local governments have emission reduction goals, energy conservation goals, building decarbonization goals, a variety of efforts underway to try to reduce their emissions and promote decarbonization throughout their broader communities. And there's pretty major barriers to local governments in the Southeast achieving those goals. Chiefly among those are state energy policy barriers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how state energy policy works and what local governments can do to get involved and engaged with those processes. So first off, I just want to set the framework for when I say state energy policy, what am I talking about? Recognizing that that varies state by state and really by context. So one state to the next in our southeastern region, state energy policy is not equivalent across state boundaries. Each state has its own utility context as well. Here in the Southeast, we don't have a regional transmission organization or an RTO where utilities are collaborating across jurisdictional boundaries. So we're really talking about monopoly or integrated monopoly utilities on a state-by-state context. So that really influences state energy policy. But at a high level, I'm talking about top-down policies that regulate what local governments and utilities can and cannot do to advance renewable energy and energy efficiency and other energy-related goals locally and within their jurisdictional boundaries. Oftentimes state-level policies, especially here in the Southeast, if you were on the webinar yesterday, you heard me talk a little bit about Dillon rule versus home rule states and local constraints on our state-level constraints on local government authority. Oftentimes, state energy policy also influences what local governments can and cannot do to achieve their greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, efforts to address energy burden, and advance energy efficiency in their communities. And these policies are often a long-term vision for how energy will be generated, transmitted, distributed, and consumed by end users, which could be individuals or commercial industrial customers. And they also set out rules to achieve that long-term vision. So whenever I'm saying state energy policy, that's kind of what I'm talking about. There's a couple different levels of policymaking that exist. We've got stuff happening at the federal level. If you've ever paid attention to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, that's the big regulatory body that regulates electric generation and transmission at the federal level. We also have regulations that are set by federal agencies like the Department of Energy or the Environmental Protection Agency. And we also have things like federal grants, which many local governments apply for, as well as tax incentives for things like renewable energy, EV charging, and things like that. We also have things happening at the state level. It's a variety of examples I've listed here. Things related to renewable portfolio standards, which set forth goals for state-based utilities to hit certain renewable targets in their generation planning. Integrated resource plans, I'm going to be talking a lot about that today, but that is a utility's 15 to 20-year vision for how they're going to meet energy load and energy needs in their jurisdiction. So what are they going to build to meet the energy need that they're seeing within their balancing territory? We also have more direct customer programs, so things like community solar, community choice aggregation. Those exist or don't exist in various forms across the Southeast, and that is very utility dependent. So you're not going to see the same version of those things state by state. And then there's lots of things happening at the local level. So things that you all as local governments can control within your authority. Things like building and transportation codes. If you were here yesterday, you'll recall that building code authority is pretty state dependent. Some states, local governments do have the authority to adopt codes that are more strict than the states. You also have the authority related to zoning, permitting, and things like that fall within the local jurisdictional authority, as well as clean energy plans and other municipal incentives for decarbonization. So just wanted to give that broad context. Obviously, today we're going to be talking specifically about things happening at the state level. And that involves I'm going to sort of simplify this to three different venues. So state legislatures, state regulators, and electric utilities. So the state legislature or General Assembly, depending on what yours is called in your state context, sets forth statutes that often require regulatory action related to energy generation and utility activities. So that regulatory body, it's called different things depending on where you're at, but if you have heard of the body called the Public Service Commission, the State Corporation Commission, the Utilities Commission, they have different names. I'm going to refer to them as Public Utilities Commissions for the purposes of this presentation, but just know that there's a variety of different names that those are referred to in different states. So state legislatures direct public utilities commissions to do certain things related to energy generation, distribution, and consumption. And that directly involves the electric utilities. So here in the Southeast, we have investor-owned utilities that are regulated by these public utilities commissions. The regulator or the Utilities Commission regulates that electric utility through docketed proceedings. So they're semi-judicial proceedings. Don't worry if you're like, what are you talking about? I will simplify that for you in just a little bit, but it is a pretty historically opaque process. What happens at utilities commissions between the regulator and the utility. It's a pretty technical, wonky topic that I hope to demystify a little bit for you today. And you might be thinking, well, why should we care? We're local governments. We don't need to pay attention to what's happening with state regulators, public utilities commissions. And I would assert that actually this is really critical to your ability as a local government to meet or not meet your climate and emission reductions goals. So as a utility customer of a regulated monopoly, oftentimes you don't have the choice of a different energy service provider. You kind of have to buy your power from the incumbent electric utility. So if your utility is not decarbonizing on a pace to meet the goals you've set, you're probably not going to be able to meet those goals either. So it's really important for stakeholders to get involved in Public Service Commission or Utility Commission proceedings related to long-term utility planning, because the things that utilities decide to build will directly impact the ability of you all as governments to meet your emission reduction goals and sort of tangentially for your community to meet its community-wide goals related to energy conservation, energy efficiency, and emission reduction. And I would say too, local governments have historically not been involved in these or have not been able to be involved in these proceedings. As I said, it's a pretty opaque process, but I would say you all as local governments are direct utility customers. You are large energy users and as well as large fleet operators. And I know many of you on the call have In addition to emission reduction goals, you have goals to decarbonize and electrify your fleet as well, which will require, more advanced planning with your utility as you're thinking about installing EV charging, and equipping your community to handle that new electric load. And you're also community stewards. So you are responsible for using taxpayer dollars efficiently and effectively to implement these programs. And you're also responsible for taking stock of what your community needs and what the critical gaps are for community services locally. So you're paying attention to not only efficient use of funds, but also what are the on-the-ground needs that the members of your community are facing and the asks that they have to you all as their government to provide better services. So you have a pretty unique stakeholder position that's different from a corporate customer or an industrial customer. And it's also really different from an environmental advocate because you have that direct place-based on the ground touch point with your community that an environmental group or a business customer is not going to have in the same way. And so I will say too, there's a variety of ways to get involved. So I mentioned that Public Service Commission or Utility Commission proceedings are pseudo-judicial, semi-judicial proceedings. That might be pretty scary to think about getting involved in something like that. And I want to assert that there's a variety of different ways that you can get involved. So I'm going to start from the top here, and I will say this list kind of goes from the top down in order of biggest investment in terms of time, expertise, and potentially cost to the least lowest barrier for entry at the bottom of this list. So there's what's called direct or formal intervention. That involves having an attorney where you can get formally involved in a case like an integrated resource plan or a rate case if you're concerned about energy affordability. Rate cases are how utilities set their prices. So what you as customers pay on your bills is determined by a rate case proceeding. There's lots of talk about energy affordability and rate increases right now, regionally as well as nationally. So that's sort of wanted to make sure that was connected here. So you can directly or formally intervene in those types of proceedings where you file comments, which are official records to the case, and the regulators or the utility commissioners who sit on the Public Utilities Commission, who sit on that body. They're the ones who are ultimately responsible for making decisions and issuing orders to the utility to do or not do certain things. So you are a direct party to those cases. You're a equal participant with every other intervener, and you can assert your opinion in sort of that official format. Sort of a step down from that, if you're not ready to take the plunge into direct intervention with legal representation, you can also do what's called a customer comment or consumer statement of position. Essentially, you could say all the same things you would say if you were a formal intervener, but you don't have to have a legal representation or sign off from an attorney to do that. That's something that SSDN has worked with a number of our members to do. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But there is a history of local governments around the region doing both the first two things on this list pretty frequently. You can also do, depending on the type of proceeding, you can do verbal public comment. So if you want to come before in a public hearing and give a 2 to 3 minute comment statement about your concerns as local governments, that's also an option. So those are sort of the things happening at the commissions. Outside of the commission, you can do things like directly engage with your electric utility. I know many of you are in touch with your customer representatives that are on staff with the utilities. That's a great place to start. If you have plans to electrify your fleet and you want to think about advanced planning to install a pretty big charging installation at a specific city or county facility, you might want to call your utility pretty early in that planning process. So there's ways to engage around direct projects like that. And there's also ways to engage with your utility if they have a proposal or some kind of a program they're working on designing that's in the design phase, to get in front of your utility and sort of share, hey, we want to participate in this program, but in order for this to work for us as a government, here are the things we need. And that's something that local governments have done around the region as well. There's oftentimes too, I mentioned program design. There's stakeholder processes that happen around the design of utility programs. SSDN often participates in those sort of on behalf of our members, recognizing that utility stakeholder processes are sometimes time consuming. But if you're interested in hearing directly from the utility as they're working on designing a program or thinking through problem solving related to specific topics like energy efficiency, low income programs, affordability, things like that, there's often ongoing stakeholder engagement around that as well. And then finally, something that SSDN is directly equipped to help our members with, as well as connecting with experts and partners, is providing this capacity building for sustainability staff, leadership, attorneys, and anybody else in your local government structure that you think needs to be involved in these types of conversations. So if you're starting from ground zero, we can provide resources and information to help you better understand what these processes mean and how to get engaged with them and sort of how they fit within broader local constraints and conversations. So wanting to get specific too, you might be thinking, this is really, might be really hard and scary to do as an individual government. And I totally recognize that. So I wanted to provide some information or sort of raise the option of collective or coalition engagement. I think it's often easier to do things in a group if you're able to coordinate rather than being the first one to stick your neck out in this type of sort of high stakes environment. So I wanted to point to two examples that SSDN members have been coordinating on over the past couple of years in Georgia and North Carolina. So in Georgia, we have a group of our members who go by the name at the commission, the Georgia Coalition of Local Governments. They have directly, formally intervened in integrated resource plans and rate cases since 2022. And I will say this has been a really successful coalition model. There are other coalitions of local governments doing this type of engagement nationally. There's one out of Colorado, one out of Ohio. There's a couple such efforts, but I wanted to stay within the Southeastern context. And if you're interested in any of those other examples, I'm happy to connect offline. One thing that I think has made the Georgia Coalition really successful is the depth of relationship that members have with each other. So I think that's something that SSDN was able to facilitate, but our members know each other really well. They know each other's priorities, they understand and have really deep trust built with each other that enables them to keep coming back to the Public Service Commission in Georgia year after year whenever Georgia Power has a new IRP or a rate case. And the involvement of the coalition has resulted in things that would not have been included in the commission's final orders had the local governments not been there. So there's certain carve-outs for customer classes that include municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals, or MUSH customers. If you're from Georgia, you know that acronym. Carve-outs in certain utility offered programs for those customers. As initially proposed by Georgia Power, those customers would not have been eligible participants, but with the involvement and engagement of local governments, that is now available to those customers in Georgia. Also wanted to flag, so sort of a step down from the formal intervention. Our Georgia members have done a lot of deep intervention in Public Service Commission proceedings, including cross-examining Georgia Power and other parties to the case. North Carolina local governments have been jointly commenting on integrated resource plan proceedings since 2020, with great success, kind of continuing to be able to come back to the table year after year. They've also done a lot of direct engagement with their electric utility, which is Duke Energy, as well as the public staff, which is the consumer advocate in North Carolina. So I've kind of talked a little bit about the benefits and drawbacks. Obviously, the formal intervention approach is pretty time consuming. It could be expensive, but you're an official party to the case. Joint comments are a little bit lower barrier to entry, but your comments are not an official record in the deliberations that the commission is making. So to wrap up, just wanted to flag some these kind of five buckets to consider if you're thinking about engaging in Public Utilities Commission proceedings. I think an assessment of your internal time and capacity. How much time do you, as the local government or the staff who would be engaged with this, have to devote to this? And if you're an SSDN member, this is something that we can help fill some gaps around. Secondly, being cost. Is there technical support or legal representation you'll need? If so, those things sometimes come with a price tag, so that's something to consider. Um, and then knowledge and expertise. This again is something SSDN can help fill if there's any knowledge gaps or things you want to understand better before you're ready to do this type of engagement. And then I would also encourage you to think about how this type of engagement aligns with your local priorities. If you've got a clean energy plan that says you want to do this type of work, that's a great start. But if there's other things happening locally that align with this type of engagement, that's great to know about. And then finally, buy-in. Do you have the buy-in from your leadership or anybody else who's an important decision maker to do this type of engagement? And if not, that's something you might want to think about doing before thinking about any of these other items. And I think that's all I've got. So I'll stop here and happy to take any questions from anybody in the chat or otherwise.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin.
Yeah.
Folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or come off mute. One question that did come up was I was thinking about the strategies that Ruthie mentioned on community engagement. How are you, Caitlin? How do you see those applied in policy work or changes?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room not only for local government engagement with these types of processes, but for community members to also get involved. And as I said, public service commissions are really they've gotten a lot more attention recently as we've heard more about energy affordability and sort of this crisis moment that a lot of our communities are in related to high energy costs and energy burden here in the Southeast. So I think for local governments and community organizations, finding alignment, like where there is opportunity to collectively share, if even if a community member or community organizations are not ready to do this type of work themselves, it is always helpful for if a local government is doing this type of engagement to speak directly about on the ground community-based experiences that they can highlight as sort of illustrative examples. So I think continued dialogue between the government and the community is pretty critical here too. So local governments are ensuring that they're actually representing the needs of their communities in front of regulatory bodies. Ruthie, I saw you came off mute a second ago. Curious if you have anything you wanted to add to that.
Oh no, I mean, I just think that was all so interesting, Caitlin. And I'm thinking about our own, the Public Service Commission. Suddenly, everybody, at least in Atlanta, knew what it was
Right.
last year and what it did. And that was very exciting. Like there was just an enormous amount of resident engagement around those campaigns,
Yeah.
greater knowledge around why we should know
Yeah.
what the PSC does and why it's important to have resident advocates essentially on that commission rather than just kind of this ossified leadership. So there was just a really nice kind of like neighborhood level sharing
Yeah.
of information, which is really asset based, right? Neighbors talk to each other. So those campaigns really played on that, like that kind of
Yeah.
neighborhood level engagement. Yeah.
Yeah, I really love that Georgia specific example because that was really exciting I live in North Carolina, but watching that conversation evolve in Georgia was like I was like, no one's talking about the PSC like this ever. This is so exciting that regular people know what this means and why it's important to pay attention to. And I mentioned this yesterday as well on our webinar we had in the afternoon. But I think the more we can speak in plain language about what happens at public service commissions, the better. Because, you know, if you are a formal intervener, you're going to have to speak some level of technical jargon just by nature of that type of involvement. But there is also an outside of the Public Service Commission opportunity to communicate more effectively about what this means for people's energy bills, what it means for everyone's everyday experience, paying for electricity and being a utility customer. And the more we can do that and effectively message around affordability, I think we're much better served.
Yeah, thank you both for jumping in on that. And yeah, couldn't agree more that community insight and pulling in and knowing how to talk jargon and not jargon are so critical. But I see Mendy has their hand up. Let
Hi,
me Okay,
can you hear
go
me?
ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to piggyback off of what Caitlin. Oh, I don't have my camera going. I apologize for that. I don't know why it's not working. Nevertheless, I wanted to piggyback off of what Caitlin was said as one of the interveners with the Georgia group. I think that it's also important for us to be kind of a bridge between the PSC and our community members. It is a very technical and complicated process, and that's not by accident. And it's not something that's easily accessible to most residents in our communities. And I think it's important for us when we're intervening to be able to translate that down to something that's accessible for our residents and for our leadership in our communities as well, so that we can use our technical expertise to kind of make it more accessible in our own individual communities, because that's something that has traditionally not happened kind of by design.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, ditto.
Yeah, thank you, Mendy, for jumping in and adding to that. And is very true. It kind of this actually picking back off of that conversation too. Caitlin, I'm wondering how what are some examples or how can we make space for those traditional stakeholders and non-traditional stakeholders to really show up in this space, especially with the assets lens? If you can add more on that.
Yeah, I think that something that I think about with particularly for local governments thinking about engaging with their public service commissions, it seems like I've heard a lot of hesitation from folks just wondering if it's almost like, are we allowed to be here is kind of the question that is unsaid. As a utility customer, anyone is allowed to be there. So whether you're a local government, a business, an industrial customer, a community organization that represents residents, you are allowed to be there. So thinking about community assets, like there's really interesting, great power in that type of reframing. Like local governments represent pretty large chunks of utilities customer base. And if, that I think is the power of coalition or collective engagement is saying, hey, we're here representing 45% of Georgia Power's customer base or 30 whatever percent of Duke Energy's customer base. I'm making up numbers. That's not actually illustrative, but it makes up a pretty big chunk of customers that, if you were going at it alone, you might not have as much pull on a utility's attention, but collective engagement, I think, does sort of amplify or exponentiate the impact of the assets of multiple stakeholders coming together as one. And I think same thing for community engagement. That's not something that SSDN directly supports, but we work with a lot of partners who are more in touch with residents and directly on the ground community focused folks, and sort of teaching and equipping individuals to speak about what's happening at public service commissions in plain language, I think really equips community members with the tools to, educate their neighbors, share information, to Ruthie's point about that neighborhood-based campaign structure. Like if people have the knowledge and the information, that is an asset that's pretty critical to encouraging more engagement, at least minimally more conversation, and spreading awareness about, this is a really important venue that's kind of flies under most people's radars unless you're paying attention to this on a daily basis. So the more we can, again, talk about this in plain language, share information, and equip people with that knowledge, I think we really harness the assets across communities.
Yeah, thank you so much. You summarized that really well. And appreciate Ruthie and Mindy jumping in as well here. And thank you for all the technical knowledge, because I think that, like you said, is critically the part that's missing, and then the conversations on how we continue to bring that into communities and talk about it, like you were all saying. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back to you, Gretchen.
Thanks, Sammy, and thanks echoing the appreciation for all of the collective discussion here, and the emphasis on how we bridge these gaps too is really a powerful one. So I really appreciate that.